there is now significant emphasis on trade as a bridge or as an enabler of our realization of socioeconomic rights, the right to development, but also really the whole idea about socioeconomic empowerment and the heart of every African citizen's lives, which is their own livelihood, both in terms of food security, both in terms of personal and human security, broadly understood. And the reason why I throw in that word is not just for semantics, or us to begin having an idea about what human security means, because it's not a discussion we can start and end here. And I know soon enough, Salima, and others are going to give us a bit more on business and human rights. So my focus really was on how do we bolster African human rights defenders to respond to the transformational CFTA processes. That was the ask. And in doing so, I mean, I've structured it. Would you want us to, is he back? Okay. Yeah, because maybe it will flow nicely now that I have not even covered too much, that we hear him just in case he disappears. So I'm happy to allow him to go, because if I then continue and we have a whole hour session and then he disappears, you are the losers. So happy always, of course, to bend backwards. So let's go with him.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mukundi. Mr. Sao, good to have you back. I think we shouldn't waste further time. If you're ready with your presentation, you could just go ahead. Mr. Sao, you're muted, please. Mr. Sao, could you please confirm whether you can hear us?
Aziz. I hope. Aziz. Hello. Mr. Saho. Can you hear us? Hello. Hello. Mr. Saho, can you hear us? Do you have a problem with your connection? I hope you're not muted. Can you confirm that? No, what I mean is ours too. Please confirm. I hope you're not muted. Yeah, we are muted. Exactly, yeah. Yeah,
hello, Mr. Saho. Can you hear us now?
Hello?
Hello. Can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you now. I think you guys were muted or something.
Oh, okay. So sorry for that. Sometimes we lawyers have problems with technology. Welcome back. We are now going to have the presentation on the Human Rights Defenders Toolkit, on how human rights defenders can effectively and efficiently participate in the AFCFTA processes. And so without wasting time, if you are ready with your presentation, you may please take the floor.
So I mean, should I say welcome back, guys, from a sumptuous lunch? I suppose you. Which is fine. Anyways, I hope Mr. Saw and Edmond will bring my own share from Kenya. I think that would be nice. So yes, I want to thank you again for your time. I mean, so basically, I think for us the assignment was twofold, right? And we had to do a study and then also had to prepare a toolkit on basically the same thing. And so obviously, the issue of scope creeping, the risk of scope creeping, was very alive, and so we were also very conscious to it. And so what I will do is I will not share any PowerPoints for this one because I think that will also save us more time, considering the so to go straight to it, the toolkit basically, was divided into chapters, and so we have 4 chapters for the toolkit, and so the first chapter looks at the background, obviously, because it's important that you have an understanding of where we are coming from with the CFT and what the mandate is in terms of the negotiations and the implementation phases. So we've looked at that on the first chapter, and then we've looked at the issue of what human rights are at stake, and in doing this, because we were able to speak to some HRDs, like I had indicated in the first presentation. Now, I just saw a message about the PowerPoint. There is no PowerPoint to share for this one. I will just go straight into it because yeah. So the chapter 2 looks at what human rights are at stake, and then more on the premise of the HRI, which is the Human Rights Impact Assessment that was conducted into the CFTA. And so chapter 3 then builds up on that by identifying what these rights are, and how they should be monitored, how their monitoring should be done against their violations, and of course to also ensure that ultimately there is recourse, and that's how the participation or the effective participation of the HRDs comes into issue. And so the final chapter also looks at the regional and global strategies that have been the strategies that are available at the international level, obviously speaking, what intervention mechanisms that we have discovered to avail the HRDs with the opportunity to effectively participate. And so obviously the toolkit looks at the opportunity that exists for effective HRD participation, because at the end of the day, you want them HRDs to participate, but you also want to HRD's participation is effective, and so so to begin with, we looked at the issue of the background, which is the CFTA. Started with the CFTA. We looked at the CFTA that we believe HRDs should receive recurring trainings on, because it's one thing to train, but it's another to have recurring trainings. From time to time, you have refresher courses on the CFTA, and then as things develop, the HRDs will come into time.
Mr. Saro,
yes.
if you could please excuse us for 1 minute. Let us sort out a problem with the translation for our French speakers.
No problem, sir. Thank you.
You can speak now, Lucia.
Are we ready? Okay. Mr. Sao,
Yes, please.
you may please continue and let's test if the mic will work. Okay, please go on, Mr. Sao. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So basically, I mean, the first chapter is focused purely on the CFDA. So it looks at the basis for its creation, which is the exceptions under the WTO rules of multilateral trade, and then the CFTA, the negotiation and implementation phases, and then it discusses the issue of rules of origin, which is quite key, because quite honestly, you cannot talk about a free trade area or a customs union without looking at what the rules of origin requirements are. Because I mean, it's essential that whenever somebody comes to you as a complaint, which is what the toolkit also looks at, is when somebody comes to you with a complaint, for example, you should be able to tell whether the goods in respect of which the complaint is made is covered under the rules of the CFTA trading mechanism. And so it also sort of highlights so that we HRDs understand that, I mean, it's not every good that is entitled, and certainly re-exported goods do not benefit from the concessions that come with the CFTA, which is the reduction of the tariffs, etc., and the preferential treatment, and there too. So we have, what we also have some of the principles like the MFN, what MFN means, which is the most favored nation, and the national treatment, which basically is saying that you should not give any third country any treatment that is far less, in terms of benefit than that which you are giving the member, with the other member of so some of those principles, they are numerous and they're very technical in their expose, but we try to bring out those that we think would be of great relevance to the work of the HRDs, and so we have. I'm sorry, excuse me, are you talking to me?
No, you may go on.
Okay, thank you. So yes, so we've also, and on that part, we've also looked at some of the instruments, because like I had said in the first presentation, I mean, the CFTA agreement, just acts as a framework agreement, but then it has numerous implementation protocols that, would be the game changer. And so keeping up abreast with the content, the procedural requirements, etc., of those protocols, I think is essential for HRDs. And then, we also looked at the issue of these agreements being deemed as a single undertaking, which means that you are bound by each and every instrument that is negotiated as part of the CFTA. So these are been taken so far in the implementation, beginning with the negotiation, then the implementation of the CFTA and the different phases that it has. So we've looked at the traces of the negotiations, and so I mean, we've also highlighted the roadmap for the African Economic Community, because essentially the entire force, if you like, about the CFTA is that eventually the continent wants to fulfill the dreams of the African Economic Community, so that you have your monetary union, and an economic community, and then eventually that has also implications on trade, on finance, and monetary policy for the continent. So it's very essential that as HRDs, we are abreast with this roadmap, because it began with the strengthening of the RECs, which is the regional economic communities, and then harmonizing the policies and principles of these RECs, because it's important, and we had discussed this in terms of the different levels of progress that each of these RECs has. Comparatively, one is more organized, more progressed than the other, and so harmonizing their programs is essential so that you are able to adjust. So as HRDs, we need to be abreast with some of these things, and the toolkit has tried to highlight comprehensively, for that matter, that roadmap for the African Economic Community. And basically, I mean, it also looks at the number of countries that have ratified, which is very important, because I mean, certainly we must understand that although 55 countries on the continent have signed the CFTA agreement, only about 45 or 44 have so far ratified it, and by implication, any country that has not ratified the CFTA, it's not number one, it's not bound by it, and number two, does not stand to benefit from some of the concessions that comes with being a member free trade area or a customs union. And so obviously as HRDs, it will be difficult to hold these states accountable, although you can hold them accountable for their pre-existing obligations under the numerous human rights instruments, both regionally and at the UN level. But I mean, as far as the CFTA is concerned, if you don't ratify, you are not bound and you don't benefit. So we have also tried to comprehensively state what countries have signed and ratified, which countries have just signed but they have not ratified, which is important. So because time constraints, I wouldn't want to go into the list of the countries which have ratified, but it's out there. And so I think that's very important to bear in mind, going forward. Of course, where necessary, to engage with these countries that have not ratified. That, okay, this is eventually essential because it advances the economic and social rights of the continent in a way that a CFTA is a means towards an end, and the end being improving the living standards and economic conditions of the people of the continent. So from that, we move on to, again, looking at the institutions that govern the CFTA. And I don't need to go through that again because the study also, as I had mentioned, the study also looked at these institutions and what significance they have in the CFTA value chain, if you like, because these are the decision makers. And obviously, it's essential also that HRDs are familiar with these institutions, so that you engage these institutions, so that you bring these institutions to account for, the actions and obviously the omissions of the state parties, because if we are moving towards a supranationalization, then so that check and balance mechanism must be led at the level of the AU. And so understanding the organs and the institutions, the players, the movers and the shakers, if you like, of the CFTA is essential for human rights advocacy in the CFTA. So we have tried to, again, comprehensively outline those things and what functions or responsibilities each of those organs have in dealing with the CFTA. And it's very essential among these organograms that we've looked at the secretariat, because the secretariat is like the day-to-day runner of the CFTA, because it makes reports and compiles these reports, and it's essential that the forums and other bodies that it will be organizing, that HRDs are aware, are informed, and are well engaged, so that trade and CFTA is not just looked at from a purely economics perspective, but of course from a human rights perspective, and so that there is that balancing act, between trade and human rights. And I believe, quite frankly, that the secretariat, should be a very active player towards this regard, and it will be interesting to see what partnerships also IHRDA and other HRDs on the continent are looking at to have, with the secretariat, because that would be a very good game changer, quite frankly, So yes, and then we've also looked at the DSM, which is the dispute settlement mechanism, as it is called, DSB, that's a dispute settlement body. And the implications that, because it's essential also that as HRDs, we know that, IHRDA cannot bring an action against the Gambia before the dispute settlement body, and IHRDA has a very good reputation for bringing cases against government. So we need to make sure that IHRDA does not certainly bring the wrong actions before the dispute settlement body, and rather, choose the right forum for the right remedies. And so we have looked at all those things briefly and concisely, for that matter, as well. And then also we moved on to look at the what we call the juridical basis for mainstreaming human rights in the CFTA. By this, we are basically looking at what are the existing frameworks that have created the foundational basis which HRDs can use and to advance the cause of promoting respect for human rights within the CFTA. And I have discussed this, I believe, comprehensively in the first part of the presentation. And also we have highlighted that and that's what the spaghetti ball effect, so that the toolkit also understands or speaks to the importance of the 8 regional economic communities that are recognized as the building blocks for the implementation of the CFTA. So and essentially, for me, we from the study, and because the toolkit is informed by the study, and so that's why we've tried as much as we possibly can, despite the challenges of time and other logistical reasons, to narrow it down to the regional economic communities and their existing courts of law as the most viable avenues for accessing justice and accessing remedies for victims of CFTA-related human rights violations, because that's very important to bear in mind. And then again we looked at the issue of the acquis, which is whether we could point to an AU law and what mechanisms exist at the level of the African Union that provide monitoring for economic and social rights generally, but of course also peer review mechanisms on the continent, ensuring that once a state party is being reviewed, that the reviews will include that state party's obligations to protect its citizens, but of course people residing therein, against violations by corporate bodies, by state agencies, non-state actors. So these are all things that we've tried to highlight, and we've also indicated the fact that it is member driven, that and the 55 countries that have signed and the 44 that have so far ratified, and the toolkit provides a list of or rather access links to the resources, and these resources are all the CFTA framework agreement and all the implementation protocols that so far are available publicly, so the IHRDs on their own accord are able to go through those websites and see for themselves, and of course get familiar by themselves with what some of these instruments are, and then so that you are able to understand, and then obviously the toolkit will provide that guide. So those pre-existing human rights obligations that are enshrined in those pre-existing human rights instruments are all stated. Access links are provided, so that any HRD that has access to the toolkit will just click on those links and you'll have access to all these instruments. And then we've also looked at a few cases of a few decisions of the African Commission in terms of the justiciability of all rights on the continent, or all rights and fundamental freedoms in the African Charter and other African human rights instruments, so that there is that understanding that there is no human right on the continent, as we want to say, human or people's rights on the continent that cannot be enforced. And so, I mean, there is that already pre-existing rights, and there is that existing judicial bodies that could be seized to litigate where necessary these things. And we've also stated what these 8 existing regs. These are obviously the Arab Maghreb Union, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA, the Community of Sahel-Saharan States, CENSAD, the East African Community, the Economic Community of Central African States, the Economic Community of West African States, and the Intergovernmental Authority on the Development and the Southern African Development Community. And now you will see that, I mean, because of the spaghetti ball effect that is very popular in like I have said before, in the African regional integration discourse, I mean, there are certain members that are, there are certain countries rather that are members of 2 or more of these regional economic communities. And so obviously, I mean, these are all things that needs to be smoothened and synchronized. And as HRDs, we must therefore speak towards the harmonization of these regional economic communities to minimize that spaghetti ball effect and ensure that there is adequate synchronization of the activities of the CFTA. So, and then the toolkit also asks the important question whether, the CFTA, recognizes human rights, labor and environmental rights. Because like I said in the summation of my first presentation, I mean, the business of human rights, if I am right, has been broadened with the with the global village that we have now, and it has included, and I mean, labor remains a very important part of human rights, I want to believe, and then so is environmental and issues of climate justice have attracted litigation now, and so it's essential that the toolkit looks into or highlights to what extent has CFTA recognized, not just human rights, but labor issues for migrant workers, but of course, environmental rights and climate justice issues for, for corporations that are dealing with community lands and community properties. And so the issue of environment is also key. However, unfortunately, like I have said, and as many of the HRDs have stated, the CFTA agreement does not, apart from a preambular reference to human rights, contain any provision on human rights. And it's the same with labor and environmental. I think the closest that we have in terms of a single or a whole clause talking about anything close to human rights perhaps would be the Article 27 of the Protocol Services, which obviously has to do with the empowerment of women and youth entrepreneurs, and that is a service industry. And we had indicated, what the service industries are, the 5 priority service industry areas. So that is something that we've also looked at. So we've also looked at the issue of business and human rights. The efforts that have been undertaking at the global level, at the level of the United Nations, and of course, we obviously talk about the UN Human Rights Council's adoption of the guiding principles on business and human rights, the UNGPS, and so which obviously involves states and civil society organizations and civil society organizations and in recognition of the state's ultimate duty as the ultimate duty bearer to ensure that human rights are not just protected, but they are also fulfilled and realized. And so And so we have provided, thanks. Also, we have provided access links to, we have provided access links to those very, yes, oh God, it's gone again. It's gone. We have provided access links to, those instruments and documents and reports of the special representative of the Secretary General on human rights and transnational corporations and other business enterprises in the passing of John Ruggie, and obviously, which form the basis of the UNGPS. And so we provided access links to these reports and materials of working groups. And so we, because that's where the discussion for trade, CFTA, and human rights would take a cue from, So, I mean, those resources would guide definitely us all as HRDs in ensuring a CFTA that is human rights compliant. And so we have also looked at, and I think this speaks to the suggestion that Mr. Sow had stated earlier about what human rights and how can some of these human rights be understood to be, under the threat of violation, as in what cues can HRDs be told that if you see these cues, if you see, these circumstances, then you should be apprehensive of the fact that, I mean, that act or conduct could constitute a potential violation of a so-and-so rights. And so, for example, we have looked at the rights of individuals to freedom of association, and then to freedom of movement, and then, and all these bills of rights, and fundamental principles and values that are encapsulated in the African Charter, and then the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and also, the African Youth Charter, for example. We've also looked at the African Youth Charter and what mechanisms, what rights it has provided for the youth on the continent, and how violations of those rights or principles or freedoms, could be examined and then by HRDAs and taken up by them to seek redress where redress becomes necessary. So we've tried to do all that within the short and long time frame that we have to do this assignment. And we've also looked at the African Charter on Rights and Welfare of the Child, because, I mean, from our research, and I must say this, the most vulnerable group is very likely to be women and children. And I think, I mean, that's no brainer. That, I mean, most of the cross-border traders are women. And some of these women are traveling with their children. And obviously this has implications on the rights of the child, on the rights of the woman, and obviously if you stretch it, and as we did, you look at other consequential violations, sexual abuse, molestations, and we've had, we've looked at scenarios where even the border post, the police officers at the border post, will be asking for bribes, and all sorts of favors, as a way of assisting that, as a way of, giving that person what obviously he is already entitled to. I mean, so all these consequential violations are very germane, and then we have tried to look at that, and even corruption, for example, because there is an AU convention on preventing and combating corruption, and so we have looked at how scenarios that can be that can give rise to violations of some of the values and principles that are enshrined in that AU Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption.
Mr.
Obviously,
Saho,
also, yes, sir.
Could you please try to conclude in 5 minutes? If possible?
How many minutes? 5 minutes?
5, yes.
It's difficult to make a presentation 45 out of 2 deliverables, so, but I'll do my best to finish on time. So basically, to round that area up, we've looked at the international instruments as well, and so including the CEDAW and whatnot. And so finally, I think because the toolkit will be available, and we are looking forward to getting all your comments and contributions. I hope IHRDA will be able to share when the time is ripe with all you amazing people, so that we can have a highly broad-based toolkit as possible. But basically and then we concluded with what intervention mechanisms IHRDAs can do, and this include how to conduct human rights due diligence, how to conduct business monitoring, how to monitor business corporations, how to create platforms and online monitoring mechanisms to track and monitor allegations of violations of CFTA related human rights or human rights related CFTA, either or, and so basically that's what the toolkit has sought to do, and in doing this we have also provided access links to some of these strategies as they are adopted at the international level, and also on the level of the continent. I have earlier stated the issue of the business and human rights policy that I from the report, it's been done in a few countries, Sierra Leone, I want to believe Uganda. So we believe that pushing that agenda will also be very helpful. And then how do you do? These are things that the toolkit speaks to and envisages training HRDs on how to conduct human rights due diligence, both ex ante and post ante, i.e. before an agreement is adopted and after an agreement is adopted, because this is very important. And in fact, even the IHRDA that was done, was very limited. And so obviously there is a lot of stakes for human rights violations. And so continuous training, we believe, will be the ultimate decider. And so what the toolkit does is, outline what these strategies are, how to use the existing monitoring mechanisms on the continent. I had spoken about the peer review mechanisms and the judicial bodies that we have on the continent, including the AU organogram, and then obviously the secretariat and whatnot. So I want to thank you all very much. I look forward to your comments and contributions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Saho. We're now open for comments, contributions, questions. And so if you would like to make a comment, ask a question, you please signify by raising your hand.
So all the I'm sorry. It's okay.
Okay, so I think what my colleague is saying is that in addition to comments provided now, some of those comments could also be provided in writing so that we could pass it to Mr. Saho and his team to consider. All right, so I have 3 hands up. Any more? Okay, that's 4. Okay, so let's go in this anti-clockwise motion from the side way here. The other one.
Merci beaucoup. My introduction will be in English, in French, please.
It's working.
Okay.
So much.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur, pour la présentation. Vous avez vraiment fait un très bon travail. C'est vrai, les droits de l'homme doivent être au centre de tout engagement dans tous les accords, dans tous les traités, que ce soit régional ou international. Ce que vous avez observé, c'est très nécessaire, c'est vraiment important. Le problème, même avant-midi, on a parlé de. Il y a un collègue qui a souligné le problème de la volonté politique, qui est souvent absente dans l'accomplissement ou alors la mise en œuvre des traités pourtant mis en place. Je félicite très bien mon pays, le Rwanda, qui toujours, par ses initiatives, encourage la promotion de la libre circulation des Africains, que ce soit au niveau des mouvements, des services ou alors des biens. J'ai une petite question à vous demander dans les recherches que vous avez faites. Qu'est-ce qui empêche les Africains, par exemple, les activistes des droits de l'homme, d'avoir des cadres beaucoup plus organisés, beaucoup plus forts et cohérents dans le plaidoyer? J'aimerais aussi demander, comme nous sommes avec remercier l'IHRDA qui a organisé ce travail, s'il peut assumer et prendre le devant, du moins en ce qui concerne ce traité de libre-échange, pour mettre ensemble les activités des droits de l'homme au niveau continental, pour voir comment il peut organiser un cadre beaucoup plus permanent dans le suivi de l'accomplissement de ces accords. Et puis, pour finir, un traité avec beaucoup d'articles, on ne peut pas l'analyser absolument pas dans 2 jours. Je remercie le courage que vous avez, mais il serait important de trouver beaucoup plus de cadres dans l'analyse de ces traités et voir comment l'applicabilité sera beaucoup plus effectuée. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sal, for the presentation. Actually, we have been thinking to the presentation and we was ready, but it's good to hear from you. That is what it is. Three things that I wanted to perhaps put forward is when we talk about human rights defenders, and fairly speaking, there are human rights defenders that are at a certain level, understanding and status. Things that can interact directly with state institutions, national governments, and so on. Usually, when we talk about human rights defenders, from mind. There are grassroots frontline. These are people who are in the community, who bear the brunt of the abuse and neglect of business people and companies. These are the people who are always defending their land, fighting for their survival, ensuring that their livelihoods are protected and are secure. These are the people who are also becoming, yes, they are the victims. They are marginalized by the local authorities. They are suppressed by government agencies. Even security agencies that are supposed to be protecting them are the ones that are also suppressing and brutalizing them. So I was thinking that there would have been an opportunity to distinguish, the situation of human rights defenders at such a level, national level, and frontline defenders, and bring out the characteristics of these two categories of people, and then indicate how they really survive. How do they, what strategies do they adopt? First of all, are they marginalized, or are they oppressed, or are they exploited, or whatever suffering they go through? And by whom? Who are the perpetrators of this? If you want to find answers, you need to ask more questions, to have an open mind and raise more questions and say, so what's the purpose? What do we want to do? We want to make sure that a localized approach to this process is really basic. But we need therefore to be very clear in describing the reality of the ground and know exactly what is happening there so we can look for solutions. So these human rights defenders and frontline defenders have strategies of how they're surviving. So these strategies need to be articulated and perhaps used to build upon them so that they can become strong, they can be strengthened to form part of the toolkit or the mechanisms that we can use at whatever level. So I think that there are also at various levels human rights institutions that can be utilized. And I've looked through the toolkit, maybe I didn't read very well, but we need to identify mechanisms, institutions like
local at various levels that can
be utilized and
made available so that
we can leverage their availability and opportunity. For instance, some of us have international
missions, institutions that are operating, and some of them have the mandate for actually human rights and business, units within them. And they have lots of national action plans, which we can also take advantage of. So I was thinking that, and perhaps we can also look at, what are the gaps that exist in the work of human rights defenders, because there are clearly several gaps, both internal as well as external. And we need to be able to identify these so that it can build our arsenal base for our engagement. I just wanted to raise these issues, but of course, it can be a question if you want to respond to some of them. But this is like, for our consumption, and see how we can build the toolkit to reflect our reality and to make us stronger, to be more responsive and effective. Thank you.
All right, thank you, sir. So I'll take Felista and Rezan. If you could please go first, Felista, and please make it brief.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Doctor, for presentation. For me, I have few inputs on area of access to remit, and as all we know, corporate compliance is very important in terms of duty to protect, respect, and access to remedy. I would like to know, I have not gone through the toolkit, but I think in Africa, we have a challenge in terms of access to remedy. As we all know, our judicial systems are not that effective, as we all know. So grievance mechanism has been a challenge. I'll talk the experience in Tanzania. And when we talk about grievance mechanism, it can be judicial and non-judicial. So I think it's important to look at which is the best approach. What is going to be the best approach in terms of access to remedy? Because we all know that most of our people are not in a position to be represented in court, and it is very expensive. And the investors in the country, they take advantage of people not understanding the law. So I think also this is the issue we should look at so that we have the best approach in terms of that. But issues of safety and security, when we do trade and we do business, the grassroots human rights defenders are at risk. And even the ones who are monitoring are at risk. So the issue of safety and security is very important, and I think we have to look at it in depth. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much for the great presentation. My comments will also border on some that have been raised by the two previous speakers. One is on the struggle that I have, hearing your initial presentation before lunch on the study and the current presentation on the toolkit and looking at the toolkit. I'm asking myself how much of the findings from the study were used to inform the toolkit, and whether that really projects the reality on the ground that is being addressed through the suggestions that are made through the toolkit. And the 4 parameters I'm looking at broadly for me is the capacity gap, which was mentioned earlier, in terms of the strength and the capacity of IHRDs to be able to engage. But the engagement platforms, which clearly still doesn't come out in terms of practically, how do you engage the structures that, for instance, we've identified at the continental level or even at the regional level, but also to stretch it further to bring it to the national level. I don't see any analysis that speaks to those structures at the national level that can be leveraged for engagement or for even efforts to mainstream human rights at that level. The knowledge gap. If you're saying there's need for training, who is going to train the HRDs? Maybe there's need to go a bit deeper on whose responsibility or who even has the mandate at that level to do the training. I find that a bit abstract in terms of how that should practically be done. The other level for me is the networking. Given the cross-border nature of AFCFTA is not a member state, for instance, national sort of agreement that will stop there. But the cross-border level of that, I find that sort of analysis also missing. If you're talking about the regional structures, country-to-country connections, how is that going to impact on grassroots, for instance, grassroots HRDs? How are those that are working country to country, what opportunities are there for them to even engage, to share information, to network and build, some sort of coalitions just beyond the individual's countries? And so finally, for me, the other issue is on the issue that Felicitas has just mentioned on remedies. There's an analysis of the regional structures. There's analysis of the continental courts that exist. What does that mean for HRDs, for instance, where you are required to exhaust your local remedies before you cross, to the other mechanisms? Maybe a bit of an analysis of practical ways of how to even get to those courts, because it's taken for granted that people understand how to even access those mechanisms, So yeah, for me, a bit of a detail on some of the points that are just generally referred to. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for those questions. Mr. Saho, you may have the floor to respond if you like.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the I don't think there was any question. I think all of them were contributions and suggestions on how to make begin with. I'm not also sure I heard what the French speaker said. But then I think there are capacity gaps, and we have highlighted that these capacity gaps exist. The HRDs that we spoke with indicated quite frankly, that this knowledge gap is there, and that they would want to be adequately abreast with the documents, the instruments that constitute the CFTA set of instruments, and in terms of the structures that are available at the national level. I agree with the lady that we have not really looked at that because like I have said in the first part of the presentation in the morning, afraid of overscoping. And it's true that we could have looked at the national structures. Each country, well, that's 55 countries on the continent. Now, each country, we presume, at least has a National Human Rights Commission or is about to have one. And also we have indicated that, I mean, at the national level, there are efforts to come up with a business and human rights policy and or strategy. Now, and we have highlighted this in this study, and now this is something that we have indicated that should be pursued, so that each country, each state party has a business and human rights strategy, and that will inform what happens at the level of that country. But at the at the regional level, at the level of the African Union, I mean, we've also talked about the AU's policy on business and human rights, and so coordinating that should be able to provide an adequate mechanism, for business, for human. Somebody indicated among the speakers, no longer, I guess, it's a big problem, and so this is with the efforts of the National Human Rights Commissions, and it will move. And now, as regards who trains the HRDs, I remember when we started this study, we had a meeting with another consultant. I'm not sure if I should state her name, but I mean, the point was that we were trying to see how we can avoid overstepping, and because that was also a continental assignment, just like this is a continental assignment. And so there are lots of, I mean, institutions and bodies and individuals, not just HRDs, who needs to be familiar with this document. My grandmother in the village, and Gambia might be perhaps the smallest village, the smallest country on mainland Africa, right? And does not even have an idea. And as a petty trader, she is most exposed to the dangers that the CFTA poses on human rights, because we have women here who are crossing the borders. And so at the borders, what happens? And somebody has asked the question, what opportunities exist for HRDs that are working across borders? And so this is essential, but these are things that we want to leave to the room. What we have done is to highlight that these issues present a very good opportunity for HRDs to effectively participate. And this is in recognition of the gaps that exist, from country to country. And then you have, it's nightmares, if you ask me, because there are official border posts, and then you have a lot of unofficial border posts. Now, as an HRD walking across the border, which border post do you go to? These are issues that exist. And so that is why for us during this assignment, we've looked at how we can have a synchronized approach at the national and at the regional level, at the level of the AU as versus at the level of each state party, and then that way we believe that so the issues could be minimized. The problem with who trains the HRDs is that in order to be effective in training any HRD for that matter, on the CFTA and human rights, you must yourself have a very good understanding of trade and human rights. And it's, I mean, the jury is out on how many experts you can find who have that combination. And so we are open to more opportunities to engage. I think that would be a good thing to discuss with Edmond. But these are people we need them, therefore, to train trainers. You train a first batch of people who then go back to train. And then I want to believe that every HRD, except, those who do not identify with any organized movements, probably most of us belong to organizations. And so what you do, you sample people from those organizations, you train them on the principles of business and human rights, what to do, how to go about it, how to conduct due diligence on companies, on the states, how to check border posts, what cues to look out for. And this, again, will go and train more people. And so you are able to create a pool of experts on business and human rights, because trade is a minefield of its own.
Hello, Mr. Sao, sorry to interrupt you once again. We're really running out of time. Could you please conclude in 2 minutes?
Yeah, no, so just to say that I think the very first step was to conduct this study and then these meetings, and then we take it from there. Of course, we are here. Whatever IHRDA wants us to do, we are more than happy to engage.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sao. Can I please ask us participants to give Mr. Sao a round of applause?
Thank you for the great presentations and answers to questions. So we had stopped a child that was about to be born, and now we'll go back to Richard and George for the next presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Colleagues, just 1 minute, stand up and stretch before we get into the next presentation. Yeah.
Can we do the stretching? Where is Gay? I'm not here.
Yeah, we want you to.
Let me come and make it down. Hi everyone. Hi. So I work with children, so I do a lot of exercises. So
be mindful of our backs.
no, because of sitting down. So I'm going to ask us to all try to touch the roof. Like you have to be very intentional in touching the roof. Okay. That one, they want it. Yeah, like why are you try to touch the roof.
Oh, you're still up there.
Okay.
Okay, stretched.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, let's try to touch the side.
Yeah, we'll touch each other. Yeah.
Guys are not actually.
We are.
We are doing
We.
it.
Touch the top and the bottom.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, the other side again. Okay. Let's try to touch the floor.
Slowly.
Slowly but surely.
Yeah.
Let's breathe in. Not in. Out. In.
Okay.
Again. Again.
Thank you, Jenna.
Okay. Again. You relax now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jenna. Thank you very much. I hope we managed to digest at least 1% of what we consumed during lunch. So we are ready to go. We're going to continue with Dr. George Mukundi, where we left in terms of bolstering Africa's human rights defenders to respond to the transformational after processes, looking at opportunities that are there, strategic and impactful human rights defenders engagement, and also putting on the human rights lens and considering some of the challenges that could be there. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Komotso Mocho. And I also really want to thank Jennifer for that teaser that helped us at least regain a bit of our energy. I imagine soon after lunch and listening to the good Dr. Satang, very excellent work, which I can tell they've spent quite a bit of time, really. I mean, if you listen to him in the morning and then you listen to him in the afternoon, I really want to commend our HRD colleagues also for retaining and broadening the tentacles of our continent to the extent that we are beginning then to have a conversation around trade and human rights, and not just about trade and human rights, but what it actually then does mean in terms of the missing middle, which is women, youth, children, persons that are vulnerable. And because we'd already gone and covered quite a lot, I'll try to really be succinct in laying out some of the key areas that I'll seek to highlight. So I'm hoping if I go over 15 minutes that you stop me, okay. And it's a call I'm asking, also really to give guys more of a chance to help us reflect together. So I know I'm starting at 16:06, and hopefully by the time we're done 21, I should be done, because I can tend to talk quite a lot. We are paid to talk as professors and as lawyers. So if you don't time me, you might end up being on the pulpit, speaking ex cathedra like the Pope, speaking masses and someone on the mount. Now, why I thought this is important and why I guess I want to thank our colleagues Edmund and IHRDA is that there are three key issues that I wanted to table for the conversation that I'll highlight. And as I said, at some point, you'll get the PowerPoint. First is what we've also listened to Dr. Satang, is very clear linkages and interdependence and interrelationship between human rights, trade, and sustainable development. That will be the first area of focus on what we can do and why it is that we are being called upon by our colleagues from GIZ and HRDA and all of us to be here. What's the relationship? And how does that relationship interlink with what we are being asked to do? The second is, a catchphrase sort of, because it comes from the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but also I can imagine that it's also very well embedded and inbuilt within Agenda 2063 of leave nobody behind. So what does that mean? I mean, because it's a nice word that we use and throw around without meaning much. But perhaps the focus is that any assessment that has tried to look at this issue has looked at the most vulnerable, the majority of our population who really continue to only enjoy these conversations when they're listening to radio and TV, as opposed to actually this thing making sense to them. And I want to focus significantly mostly on women, on youth, on persons with disabilities, and also really what we heard, I think, from the colleague who asked there, that to what extent indeed are we engaging those really who are human rights defenders in the grassroots? Not in fact many of us who sit in boardrooms and stay in nice hotels, but those individuals and actors that on a daily basis, they are whacked and thwacked by the police because they've tried to stop a concession. They've tried to stop private developers developing community land, forests being acquired, the role Wangari Maathai played in this country. And that for me is the epitome of human rights defending, that we enjoy the fruits of this green city significantly because of people like that, not aware that there will be a CFTA, but the way that climate change is real, that we are beginning to feel a lot of cold in this city and across the continent and everywhere, high rising temperatures in Europe and also, I guess, in West Africa and in the Sahel, where we are asking why is that happening? Melting glaciers, and we forget that there is an interlinkage between what we do now and what we will do into the future. And that's why I'm talking about leaving those ones not behind. The last point that I think also is important is doing a cost-benefit analysis. Is there a cost to this CFTA? Is there a benefit? I think all of us are totally in agreement that there are very many benefits. But as human rights defenders, sometimes we also want to be the devil's advocate. We look at the costs. And why I liked what Jackie was saying, that look, we hear about this free movement, it's nice, but also it comes with some costs that we also don't factor in. Let's not forget that that's an issue. So what are the costs that then, as human rights defenders, our defense is to the cost and the challenges that High Commission for Human Rights and Frederick Ebert Sifton, led by a guy called Jimmy McLeod, and he's actually also written a paper. And academics, we like citing others because we do not have monopoly of this idea. So now McLeod and his team at Frederick Ebert Sifton, they look at what human rights and the CFTA. In other words, they're taking stock and navigating the way forward. And they trace it back. That study is a little longer, older, in that it looked back in time, even before we then have started this process for implementation during the phase 1 negotiations and the phase 2 negotiations. And now, in fact, also, I was quite happy when I had and looked at the toolkit that's been prepared by Dr. Satang. He's going even to the third negotiations that also looking at e-commerce and, privacy rights, access to individuals' bank cards, and our own identities where you have huduma numbers and things like that, that also open up spaces also for abuse. To what extent do we allow these issues and spaces really to tackle? And why I thought it might be important is that for many of us human rights defenders, our Bible is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And of course, there are many others, the Malabo Protocol, of course, on the court. There's, of course, the Maputo Protocol, which I will not go into the details of it because we've analyzed it. There's, of course, the African Charter on Children and Welfare of the Child, which Watoto will be quite happy to know that I'm citing it, not just for them, but in fact that we are also taking due cognizance and knowledge of these issues, but also the African Youth Charter, which are the instruments and the tools that the AU has put together, that as we engage as human rights defenders, important that we understand the normative and institutional framework and arrangements that allow us to do what we do. I think the main emphasis for me is that out of the 25 rights that are in the Charter, we know 3 are duties. And it's very important that, it's one charter that not only provides for us rights, but also provides duties. But I'm not too worried about the duties because that's for us we'll do. And I know we are quite familiar with those ones. Out of the 25, 10 really are heart-on on what we should do and can do. And I just want to quickly read out some of those provisions, not necessarily to go into the depth of it, but if you want, in terms of the questions, we can get into it. Really, the first one is Article 9 and the access to information. Half of these debates, half of these discussions remain in archives in the periphery held by government agents. How much do we know what we know? And what do we know that what we know is actually what we should know? I think that's a key issue. Now, the second one is the right to property. And I really look at Loliondo, I look at the issues in the concessions, where, yes, there's a whole discussion. And in fact, what the charter is very interesting, unlike many of our domestic constitutions, which says, don't take away right to property, that almost presupposes that you already have property. It talks about right to property. And it's important. So what does that talk to? And also the linkage and the relationship also with another right on disposal of wealth, which is Article 21. And I read those two together because I think they're important. That at what point, especially where we are also seeing lack of compensation by governments when they're giving concessions to multinationals and foreign agents to be able then to deliver what we are hearing are industrial parks and spaces like that. What is the role for us as human rights defenders to be able to protect those particular rights? I won't go into what I know Salima will cover in terms of right to work, right to access to health, right to education, because really this is a subject I already can tell from the discussions I had, in a sense, prepared for those, and that's Article 15, 16, 17, but also really persons with disability in Article 18. I think for me, under Article 21, and I think it's important, is the whole idea in that charter on rights to eliminate foreign exploitation, economic exploitation. And we're beginning to see signs and trends within the CFTA that perhaps that is going to be a reality rather than actually a wishful thinking. And we are seeing in Loliondo, we are seeing in everywhere else. We are seeing even here, not just by WHO, but of course almost in every other country, that this becomes such a huge elephant in the room and a significant cost if you're not careful about it. Of course, the right development, which Nasuna again highlighted and insisted, which is Article 22, the right national and international peace and security, again, the linkages between trade, socioeconomic development, and our ability to really live a peaceful life, where you have to look at the right to life, keenly, and not just taking away right, but how you look at it positively, which has been argued significantly in areas where many of our constitutions that don't have socioeconomic rights, how you interpret progressively in a justiciable format the right to life, as also means that if they, in fact, then you cannot be able to have a proper livelihood, then you actually have no life. So what does that necessarily mean? That you are actually then asking member states, we are also asking ourselves how we champion, how we argue these issues, not just before just courts of law, but also in other spaces. Of course, satisfactory environment. The 3-4 case studies I wanted to highlight is because that study I mentioned earlier, or that paper, looked at one of the core areas that I mentioned that is important. One is the informal cross-border traders. And what are the areas there? So I'll mention 5 areas: informal cross-border trade and what we can do as human rights defenders. I'll also talk about, because I realize we have some colleagues of ours who are interested in CADEP and right to farmers, just to make you happy today. And the whole idea about food security, because when you're in this our country where you've had some sima and ugali for lunch, you wonder where that came from and whether it's going to be more expensive tomorrow after elections. So food security, not just because of the current crisis and the grain crisis, but also because it also affects fertilizers, it affects almost everything else. How sure are we with climate change, with trade, that in fact we'll not trade away our food security? And for the Ethiopians, the injera. Now, we'll also talk about right to work and employment, which is also a key area that is covered by the CFTA, but perhaps I think also extremely important for us to think through. Now, the issue of how we must be and participate equitably and in a very coherent fashion in the negotiation process for the remaining phases, now that we know what we know. And now that we know that actually what we know is useful for us to be able to make some interventions and influence those policies. Of course, the monitoring and evaluation, which is also one of the key areas that has been highlighted significantly, making sure that we have human rights indicators in those processes and the institutional mechanisms. Now, on each one of those, I have a couple of areas where I can go deeper into each one of them if we had time. And the first one, I guess, I will only maybe highlight on the informal cross-border trade area. But if we need to, we can get into the others just to respect your time, Mr. Chair. First is the entire idea about cross-border trade was not part and parcel of the immediate formation of the negotiations. So it came as a by the way later to understand that in fact also informal cross-border traders should be beneficiaries of the CFTA. What does that mean? That there are a lot of negotiations, there are a lot of agreements, there are a lot of protocols that did not factor the role of informal cross-border traders. And that essentially means, you know, unless we appreciate our mothers and women who have to travel across the borders in borderland areas, then there are significant human rights issues. And just to point one or two on, say, infrastructures on border areas, around human security and the personal security of women, for instance, who have to travel by bus by night with nobody or chaperone, who also maybe might have sexual reproductive health issues and also sanitary issues, access to toilets, access to water, access to services, and COVID revealed many of these issues. But we have not thought through those processes. So yes, we have the open border posts, but to what extent have they also addressed those issues? I think we can't just be human defenders by going to court. It's to say, if indeed we are serious about these elements, then those are areas that has to be factored in. And I argue that I think when we are serious about not just transforming our street cred in just shouting on streets, is really making sure that we are not only recognizing those spaces, we're also recognizing what needs to be done in some of those issues. Issues of social protection, which we've learned significantly, including transfer and mutual recognition of health medical facilities and access. When you then are in Uganda, you've just gone to trade your tomatoes, and suddenly you fall sick either because of COVID, and you cannot use your NHIF card in Uganda. So what does that mean for this trade? You either stop trading. Just a few illustrations. Now, on farmers, just so that my friend doesn't think I was promising heaven and delivered hell, is the issue of subsidies. And I mentioned that because it's a key issue. Because remember, subsidies, and of course, the free market liberalization has significant elements in terms of how we address and look at this issue. But there has been limited consultation, participation, and inclusion of farmers in these discussions. Yet we know the majority of the trade, perhaps also for some of our countries, is going to continue to be agricultural products. That's the truth. So to what extent are we making sure that also when we are privatizing, when we are allowing huge multinational corporations to be able to trade, we also not neglecting and making sure that the small scale holders, farmers, whether they're sugarcane farmers or whether they're tea farmers, that their rights and issues are also not in the margins. And I think this is for us extremely key, both in the trade remedies and the safeguards and the capacity building and the policy spaces for those dialogues. Chair, without preempting some of the suggestions I wanted to make, because I have just 7, and I'll just highlight them in clear data in terms of what call to action, proposals for our consideration. The first one, and I think really, is that when we're engaging in this subject matter, the focal point, and especially because IHRDA is involved in this work and has continued to do this work, and many of you also are part and parcel of significant institutions, unless we are disaggregating the data and analyzing it, especially on gender, for instance, the women who are in the informal sector, we are not going to be able to influence government policy to think CFTA in that area because it was not through, but we need to prevent enough data that actually showcases this is important. And what are the challenges, what are the risks, what are the issues that are involved in this area. The second point is the impact of trade liberalization and market forces in terms of driving vulnerable groups way more into the periphery. And I said this is important because the whole CFTA, you hear about tariffs, you hear about taxes, and who bears the costs, when indeed that we're giving those costs, because somebody has to pay for those costs. Who is that person, the beneficiary, the final person who is paying for those costs? When we actually allow just a few individuals to be able to bring in oil, and then also then escalate the oil and the fuel price increases, the person who actually bears the person who is buying paraffin fuel. Are we thinking about those issues? Also then when we are saying it's a good thing that we are showing that we have huge trading volumes between Kenya and Uganda, And yet you then see at the micro level, the losers are the people we are saying we are defending. The third point is really the vulnerable groups, where we had that woman, especially in Sri Lanka, say the richer are only gonna likely get way more rich through the CFTA, and the poor are gonna likely get more poorer. What will they do unless we address some of the challenges that they say? The reason I say this is because we had a discussion earlier about the state development paradigm, where certain aspects should not just be left to the private sector. Health, education, security, and some of those other elements. So as human rights defenders, I think that's our clarion call. No matter how much liberal Western thinking we may be, there's a place for social security and social welfare, subsidies and some concessions that are also allowed to cushion the very most vulnerable of our population. The issue of policy coherence, and I say this because it's important, half of the discussions, and I think why Satang was saying, look, it's not possible for me to be able to preview all the 55 member states in terms of what they're doing and how they're doing it. I think why it's important for us is to also say, are there inconsistencies in some of our policies that develop these issues, especially when it comes to implementation on trade liberalization? The fifth point is tracking citizens' voices and skills using scorecards. Now, the study I gave you earlier does actually have 7 scorecards that looks at some of the 7 areas. Is there something IHRDA would also consider? Because unless then we are having a scorecard, and doesn't also have to be a scorecard, all that we do is then castigate. I argue a scorecard is only as useful also if it also raises red flags, but also equally recognizes where things are going good. As Africans, the first thing you tell me, I actually like your Pan-African outfit. Even without liking you, I start liking you. Before I know it, you've told me, but Mukundi, you also talk too much. And I'll likely take that seriously. But it's how you say it. And I argue because human rights defenders, and I like IHRDA, they're changing tact in some of the areas, and I know they'll be having some serious discussions with the Nubians and the Kenyan government, because yes, you did get the Nubian case out into the field. And similarly also in the CFTA, if all we do is criticize what government has done without also realizing what they've done and done well, I think we have a problem. So perhaps an innovative tool, a dashboard that you can also showcase, because you have the case analyzer. So you have the tools, you have the technology, you have Watoto here, who I have seen are super beautiful and brilliant in terms of disseminating this level of knowledge. You have the West African Radio Network, which is equally also really showcasing some of the work we do. So knowledge, advocacy, capacity building, and dissemination as the 6th point. Really, again, focusing on access to information. The 7th and the last point is what all of you asked, the role of geopolitics. I think we can't just be talking about the problems in our own nation states and our own countries. We also have to also say where the problems are outside. And that's the voucher funds, which is related to the IFFs, the regional, institutional and global institutions reforms, which some of us have access as human rights defenders, not even as institutional role players. WTO, WHO, TRIPS, WIPO, that yes, you say what can work under the CFTA, but also what is it that even some of our partners like GSZ and the Germans, what's their interest in this story? Besides giving you the money. I don't think Madame Risan is going to tell us exactly what they're interested in this debate, but I think it's something we should ask. Because yes, fair enough, they brought us into this small, good hotel, but we equally also should critique the role of external actors. Why is it that it's not the Kenyan government or any of our actors who actually brought us together as human rights defenders to be able to talk among ourselves? So we are careful not to criticize GSZ or the Germans or the European unions or the many actors that give us some pocket change. But it is important that we discuss the financing for some of the platforms and frameworks. I thank you, Chair.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Doc. At least I've learned one thing. When you say 15 minutes, we mean 30 minutes. So I've noted that. Colleagues, I'm going to open the floor for questions, comments, and input. But I think maybe we should start with our online colleagues, if you can check whether they're still there. Because the problem with that is that people sometimes connect and go and make tea. So let's check if there's some comments and questions from the online colleagues. Yes, noted. I was just checking our online colleagues then. Okay. While you're still checking them, yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, George. And I want to ask you about something I wanted to ask earlier, but you were not in the room. But when Rizan was asking about the inroads, how do people start engaging with these continental frameworks also in the negotiation process? But you having been within the AU, I'm wondering whether there is still a role for the ECOSOC that was meant to facilitate CSO engagement with the African Union, whether it's still a useful mechanism to work with in terms of bringing in people's voices into this process.
Thank you very much. Over to you.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I think all today's sessions are interconnected. Effectively, there are so many challenges regarding human rights defenders. The promotion and the protection should be ensured through the platform that we have here, that we have in the African Union, RECs, which from my point of view, they are not working. For instance, for example, the Maghreb Arab Union is inactive. As a human rights defender, we cannot get in touch with them. Secondly, I think during the 2 days, we should come up with concrete strategies. Therefore, what are those strategies behind building capacity, etc.? I think we should also engage the officials and the custom who is going to train them about the respect of human rights. Then also the regional mechanism. They are so important to get in touch with them, and not only to get in touch with them, to make advocacy and synthesize the regional mechanism on their importance as an organs of the African Union to press the states to respect human rights, especially when dealing with the Treaty of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Thank you.
Thank you. Last two questions. Yes, you are the last one, then I'll come this side. Then, yeah, the last two questions you respond, Doc, then we'll go to the second round. Yeah, in that sequence, my sister and you.
It's not actually a question, it's just something I would like to add because as human rights defenders, we never know. So like I said in my introduction, I work with IHRDA, Young African Defenders in Action. And it is a Pan-African movement for human rights defending across Africa. For now, we have representations in about 15 African countries. So last 2 months, IHRDA came up with an initiative to start a magazine with the aim of documenting all the human rights violations that human rights defenders across Africa face on a daily basis, either from their governments, from individuals, or from organizations. So, and we focus more on grassroots human rights defenders because they are the ones who lack the visibility and their voices often go unheard. So if you are here and you know of any human rights defender who falls within this category, or maybe you are one yourself, you can talk to me after this so that we can document everything that you are facing in that magazine. And depending on the extent of the violation, you can be evacuated to our headquarters at the African Human Rights Network Foundation in Tanzania, which also serves as a shelter home. So I just said I should share this with all of you because we never know as human rights defenders.
Thank you very much. Over to you, my sister.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Perhaps what I would like to know, maybe not only from him, maybe we can discuss it, how because of the shrinking civic space that we are facing in our countries, how as human rights defender we can advocate and be safe and be protected at the same time, because in other countries it's not as easy, you know, to talk about these issues. Even in our own country, I haven't had any civil society being invited to the table to talk about the CFTA agreement. So how do human rights defenders get the protection that they need, and how do we operate in vis-a-vis shrinking civic space? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doc. May I humbly request you to respond? Then we'll take the last round. Yeah.
So thank you, colleagues. Let me start first with Salima. And you're lucky that you have Rizan. One is that I hope over better beverages, the two of you can have some engagement, because this is something she's tried to do for the longest. And you and I also have engaged in these issues, and especially related to the question that also your sister next to you also asked. I mean, it's a cliche term really used, invented and invited spaces. Half the time, let me ask one very simple question. How many of you have been to the AFTA Secretariat website? Raise your hand if you've been to the AFTA Secretariat website. Who knows who is the CEO of the AFTA Secretariat? Who knows what's the name? What is his name? No, I'm not asking you, Jackie. I know you'd know. Who knows who is the secretary or the executive secretary to the AFTA Secretariat? The South African should know because he's South African. So I expect you to know. Because he's your... Huh? Your neighbor should know.
I'm sharing, so I don't want to be too conflicted.
Okay.
Yes.
Who knows who is the chair of the Secretariat? Who has this week been to the AU website? This week? This week? What were you looking for? What were you looking for?
Some information regarding ECOSOC and
ECOSOC.
Yeah.
My sister, who raised your hand, what were you looking for at the AU website? Yes? Children's rights, yeah. Now, the reason I ask this is that half the time we ask stuff that is available publicly in portals. We say we don't know. We don't know what's going on. We don't know what's going on in the negotiations. Who will invite us to those negotiations? How will you be invited? Because nobody knows. I was sitting some while back when I stepped out because we're organizing something called the Tana Forum. The Tana Security Forum is the premier security forum on the continent on security matters in Africa. And you have, say, 5-6 people deciding who will come. If we've never heard of you, if we have no idea that you are a subject matter expert, and sometimes also our biases, which we are happy to reveal, all of us have biases. That's the reality of life. Now, how do you deal with unconscious bias unless we know? Now, I've heard of Watoto. Today I've seen Watoto, news that is, and I know IHRDA, but I know IHRDA from Geso and Edmund. How did I know these guys? And I'm not saying it's a know somebody thing. That's your answer to you, is that half the time as human rights defenders, many times we agonize, we claim that these things don't exist when they're there for us, if only we did a couple of things. That's the first point I really want to emphasize. Do some bit of background research. Like the study I just shared, it's available on Google search. The first thing, if anybody was trying to do human rights and CFTA, it's a publicly available document. So, I mean, I didn't even need to speak on these issues because it's the basis, because it was also done by institutional formations, UNECA, Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and then also this institution, but it's done externally. Why can't we have the same study? And I'm glad that at least IHRDA is doing its own study that then is going to show an African voice bringing these conversations to the table, reflecting our perspectives, because this study is a UN study and a German organization, not an African. If you search, you will not find an African really leading these discussions. And for me, that's what is super impressive about this forum, that we are coming together, all of us, not to complain and argue, but to say, what can we do about these issues? So the issue on ECOSOC is that there's been significant transformation. Like many of you, including Rizana, and I know many others, everybody had given up on ECOSOC because it is a civil society entity within the AU. I was in Lusaka last week where we were discussing constitutional changes in government with them follow-up to the Malabo summit and the Accra summit that discussed UCG. It was such a useful meeting. First, because they brought in, say, 200 people. It's the first forum they've brought post-COVID that shows that they've changed their thinking on the Livingstone formula, which decides who civil society engages with the AU through ECOSOC. To say, even these organizations that are claiming to be the legitimate, credible ones, they are perhaps not. They are just briefcase ones. And that's why you've seen they've suspended 7 officials for reasons we know so very well why. Now, why do I say that? Is that there's a guy called William, who is the current head of the Secretariat, and Nana, a Ghanaian guy. Fantastic young people, brilliant thoughts, brilliant ideas. Would be a pity if we continue with this program or this investment without engaging ECOSOC. Because the truth is, on paper, they're the one institution recognized by the African Union to facilitate civil society engagement. So you can organize a parallel, separate entity. And we tried to do that when ECOSOC failed. There's something we used called CCPAU. It was closed because it doesn't have legitimacy. And it cost us so much money. I mean, when I think of how much money we spent on CCPAU using partner funds, and yet at the end, the partners always come to say, but whose voices are you? Because all of our voices, even as human rights defenders, we can be questioned. You're speaking on behalf of who? Who gave you the vote? Who gave you the right? Those are questions we always ask. Yeah? So this is a space and a platform that I think we need to engage further with and not wait for invitations. Invite ourselves, and this forum, and I'm hoping the communique or the outcome of this process is nicely well highlighted, but it's also concrete to the extent that they are actionables that can take us to the next frontier. Now, you asked about seed. How do you grow? How do you nurture? I mean, I was also fascinated over lunch, just to hear, Watoto, I think some years back, you're 5, now apparently you're 25, and they don't always rely on partner funds. Because unless you're financially sustainable as an entity, and I tell that to IHRDA, they're one of the few organizations where their founders, who are interns, by the way, at the African Commission, they thought of investing in a building and in land where they don't then have to pay rent. That has transformed IHRDA to the extent that they have a trust that for the longest, they will not always rely on partners. I'm not saying all of us can be IHRDA, but it's because they're using resources like consulting, value proposition. Yeah? For you to be seen and also to be heard, there has to be something that makes you be part of the ballgame. And it's not how you speak, what you say about, it's also the issues that you raise and how you raise those issues. The issue of shrinking spaces, of course, is real. But why is it shrinking? I don't think I'm the right person to answer those questions, because perhaps you might say I'm one of the guys contributing to the shrinking of that space. But I don't think I am. And I want to defend myself just to say that what role have we also played to make those spaces shrink or even propagate the narrative that they're shrinking? Not to say that they're not shrinking, but that in these same spaces, the grassroots movement that he talked about, yes, they're shrunk, but they're still as effective and impactful. It's us who wants to hold big meetings in boardrooms in the city, in Nairobi, who perhaps may claim those things. And I worry because, I came from the back in time, human rights movement back in time with our people. We were fighting for constitutional reforms. Now, once we achieve that, we have nothing else to fight for. So then half the time is just fighting infighting. So we are not credible. We are not accountable even to ourselves, even to our partners. Neither are we accountable to nobody, even as human rights defenders. And I know it's very controversial, not something everybody wants to hear, but I am allowed to say so by Edmund and Geso.
Thank you very much, Doc. Last round of questions. Also, let's check our colleagues online. Edmund, any comments from the online question? You continue. Let's start with you. Okay. And then you'll be the last.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Mukundi. You are actually a star presenter. Why are you smiling now? No, don't expect that. No, I think that you actually have said a lot of good things that really serve both as a strong warning to human rights defenders, but also a challenge to all of us. Want to be proactive and to stand out there and count, not only to be counted, but also to count. And I think that's very important, because if we don't do that, then we definitely we can't influence the change that we want to see. I was thinking that the African continent is so our leaders, let's put it that way, our leaders are so much seem to be uninterested in their citizens, but also very much carried away by the big multinational institutions who they listen to and accept, and always even against their own people, like the World Bank, the IMF, African Development Bank. So I was wondering, what is your take on the role they play, and in what way that we can neutralize that role concretely as human rights defenders? Because our governments are afraid of them. They wouldn't want to challenge them. Sometimes they even say they hide behind civil society, some civil society groups or other people. So is there a way we can really find a way of making sure that they also get to be account for what happens, and so that they can at least create the environment that will make things work for our governments and our people and ourselves? Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, my sister.
Right. Thank you very much, George. I like the star presentation comment. You spoke quite a lot about some of the most pressing issues when it comes to the AFCFTA processes. And these are ongoing conversations, even at the AU level. And I hope maybe as part of the going forward from this meeting, some of these issues can be picked up and reflected upon. I have one question specifically with regards to the digitalization wave that is taking place globally, but also on the continent. What do you see out there as the potential digital tools that HRDs can use when it comes to engagement and in such platforms? I mean, COVID has taught us a lot in terms of, online engagements, but also speaking to the protection and security issue. There are quite a lot of anonymous tools that can be used in, the engagement of HRDs. But for me, in your own perspective, from an experience perspective, what would be some of those tools that could be emulated going forward?
Thank you very much. If you can respond in less than 3 minutes, not 6, we'll highly appreciate it. Thank you.
No, thanks, because there are two. I will likely make a good effort. The truth is, we are not an island. That's the truth. So we live within the global political, legal, financial system, and that's the reality of this life. So we may want to imagine that we are exemplars, but we are not. So we still have to align ourselves also to the global thinking and the global discussions and debates that are happening both at the IMF, at the World Bank, or the WTO, or WHO, and all those issues. Because, we've seen even our government sometimes listen to those actors more than they listen to our own institutions. So, that's why I say that we should always see these things from two sides of the coin. A friend of mine, Christopher Mbazira, Professor Christopher Mbazira, who, people would know, he would always remind me that there was always two options. If you choose this option, you could have picked another choice. And if you pick another choice, you could equally also pick another choice. So it becomes almost like a pyramid scheme, if you like. Why is that analogy important? Is that you can choose to lie on one end of the bargain. And that's why I said many of us who, of course, have been educated in the liberal market-driven systems are quite aligned, of course, to that thinking and saying the social Karl Marx school of theory and thought doesn't have place in the modern world. But perhaps we are looking at the wrong choices. Because what I argued earlier is that maybe sometimes we ask the wrong questions for the wrong audience. And that's why the IMF, the World Banks, the actors like that will continue playing a role. It's choices we make. The Ghanaians right now, as I said earlier, are torn in between making very difficult choices, whether to go back and ask IMF for help, because they can't be able to retain their liquidity challenges, their financial but the debt repayment systems. And so no one in the private sector is going to do that, and nobody is going to give that money to the private sector. So the IMF then will come, and they come with a package, and nothing happens. So then we look at those issues and then ask ourselves, what are the role of the credit agencies, which is our colleague both at the APRM, they're trying to do. And then everybody wants to shut us down when we try to even create a credit rating system. I say that also, and I'm glad my colleague from Ethiopia has come, because there are lessons we can learn from our colleagues internally. Ethiopia, when they wanted to build a dam against all odds, they decided to raise money domestically. It's not a popular decision across the world from some of the external actors, but they decided, and that's something nationally, they build traction. What does that suggest? What do we learn from Rwanda? Whatever we may say about that country, they've said, look, we will figure out what to do about the things that we care about, whether we agree or not. Now, that has changed even perspective. Now, interestingly, Biden was in Saudi Arabia this week. Why? When they'd said that those guys killed Khashoggi. And so they should not engage with those folks. So we must always realize that everybody has interests. What's our interests? And this is why even the Ukraine crisis and the war and all those issues and COVID also raises some very difficult questions, even as us, as human rights defenders. Not to say that they're not significant issues. Look at how they're treating our boat people in the Mediterranean. And yet they had open arms for all privileged folks who are able to get in. I'm not saying it's just because those people have suffered and suffered significantly, but it must waken us up. We know about the COVID situation and vaccines and access, where they spoiled most of them. Why? So what can we do? So as we criticize our own governments, we must equally also ask ourselves, what are we doing also to advance a conventional idea about what needs to happen? When you think about SATEM, when you think about Africa CDC and what they've been able to do. On digitization, I think I said I will focus on women, youth, and persons that are vulnerable. If you think of financial inclusion, and what the mobile money market has helped us to do, and if we actually think it's a good idea, how also, because the e-commerce protocol is now currently being negotiated, are we there in those conversations? Have we looked at the drafts? Do we know who are the draft makers? I mean, when we were in Addis, and the reason I was telling Salima, maybe Rizan will help you more. Rizan was more instrumental for us to get the state law, state of ACDEC rules of procedure adopted by member states. Because unlike many actors, she knew every ambassador in Addis. I don't know how. I can't tell you. She knows. She walked into those spaces with a lot of difficulties. Women, you would know, because those are very difficult spaces, with the sexual harassment, with the all manner of fears, and many of those conversations happen in very smoky, dark rooms. But somehow you find ways in which you're saying yes and no, and at the same time making sure that the stuff that needs to be done gets done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doc, for your very thought-provoking and insightful presentation. Let's give Doc a round of applause. Thank you. Over to you.
Vivian, your friend is presenting. Interestingly, I met both of them together in Angola. African Commission session, yes. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I intend not to let my speaker take all our time. We have already eaten into so much of your time this evening, but we apologize and please allow us to take extra few minutes of your time to go past the 5 p.m. time we had agreed. And also on that note, I will quickly say tomorrow we start at 8, not 9. So let's start early and finish early so you can explore Nairobi. I'm sure the Kenyans will be happy to take you around. Yes, I would like to introduce Mrs. Sekana Salima Namusobia. She is the Executive Director and also founder of Initiative for Socio-Economic Rights in Uganda, and a brilliant lawyer who has also litigated on the same in our country and has successfully brought good cases before the court. She's going to discuss protecting human rights in the regional economy. And of course, this is very important for us. It's key for us to have on this discussion. And as you know, as human rights defenders, it's very pivotal for us to be involved in these discussions to ensure that we hold states accountable, specifically in the ECOSOC lens. So Salima, the floor is yours. And I don't know how long you'll take, but I'll give you 20 minutes and then 10 minutes for a discussion. So that should give us until 5:20.
Wow. Thank you very much, Lydia. It's very difficult to have the last session of the day when people are tired, and you gave a very wide topic. There's a lot to discuss, and I didn't know like the levels of the people in the room. Where do we start from in terms of discussing business and human rights? But now we are caught between time and trying to understand the concept. So I guess I will skip a lot of the beginning bits. I intended to talk about what business and human rights is about and the different pillars. Perhaps, Edmond, you can just project the pillars there. And this topic is very, very important with regard to the topic we are discussing about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And first of all, I want to emphasize that this agreement and all the framework documents that are involved has the potential of enhancing economic and social rights. It's not that it's all negative. It's not that we are here just to criticize what has been done, because if it is done well, even as we are discussing the risks that there could be for example, informal workers, there are a lot of advantages that could also be there, because as you heard in the morning, for example, the agreement recognizes informal traders. There are two sides of the coin, like George has been saying, but again, it can be useful. But also, if the things that have been discussed are done, issues to do with allowing for improved freedom of movement, allowing for these traders to move around and aiding the informal traders and protecting women and the youth, then we are bound to have poverty alleviation and improve the socio-economic well-being of people. So I just want that to be clear before we get into the discussion. Secondly, I want to emphasize, because the conversation was around human rights in a regional economy, that a lot of the discussion will also center around extraterritoriality. What are the extraterritorial obligations of states within the business context that we need to look at? So I've just put there, I had a video to show just around the concept of business and human rights, but maybe we can show it at the end. I think it's on the next slide. So you skip those ones and I just get to, yeah, that is where the video is. We shall come back if we have the time. But as we are discussing trade, as we are discussing business, we need to also understand how to speak to the business people. Like George was saying earlier, that sometimes you do not go into the conversation all being negative. You have to motivate the people within the state, the space, for them to appreciate, you know. So I quickly wanted to look through some of the myths and realities regarding business and human rights. And one of them is the fact that many people believe human rights and business are opposing concepts that cannot coexist. But the actual reality is that actually business and human rights are mutually reinforcing, and they should be able to aid each other. And then the other issue is around human rights being the concern of governments. But clearly where we are going, we are getting into a space where corporate actors, private sector players are the ones leading our economies, and we need to start interesting ourselves. Human rights should no longer be state-centric, as we've grown up knowing that actually we look towards the state for each obligation. We should be able to also now start looking at the business side, and then also for businesses to understand that because they do corporate social responsibility, this does not discharge their human rights obligations. They need to go beyond CSR and take seriously their human rights responsibilities. And lastly, the fact that many people think businesses do not benefit from respecting human rights. The reality is that there is a strong business case for respecting human rights, and which is what I try to show on the next slide, which I will also skip because of time, but it's essentially looking at what do businesses gain from engaging in human rights. And one key one, for example, would be around if they are involved in abuses, what is the cost of litigation, for example? If they are taken to court, what they lose is actually a lot more in terms of also their reputation and the branding. People could go back to that diagram later. So just to speak to some of the issues that could come up with regard to the arrangement we are discussing around the Continental Free Trade Agreement. And first of all, there is the issue of labor rights. And what is bound to happen, you know, that states have different standards in terms of labor. Many of our states do not even have a minimum wage. So what is going to happen as we are moving across borders, but also the fact that there is a lot of informality is bound to cause challenges in terms of realization of labor rights, but also rights in employment, issues to do with, for example, leave for people who are working. There's different standards across the region that we need to look into. Then earlier, George talked about the issue of social protection and social security, which is very, very key as we deal with the regional economy, because again, right now, the continent is at 10% coverage for social protection generally, and it is mostly for people involved in the formal sector. And people who are in the informal sector who are bound to be disrupted with this arrangement are largely not covered, but also there has been discussions of portability of benefits. And when we talk social protection, we are also including issues like health and education being a part of the social protection package that people should be able to access. So what happens for people who are moving across borders to go and engage in trade, especially the vulnerable groups? Then looking at the vulnerable groups, what is likely to happen under the regional economy? We've already talked about the informality, and with the informal sector, again, we mostly have the women and the youth involved mostly with the informal sector. But some of the detailed issues that could happen there, for example, relate to skilling. As we talk about the CFTA, you know that people with skills are likely to benefit more from this arrangement than people who do not have skills. So as we are trying to ensure that vulnerable groups benefit, we need to interest ourselves in ensuring, for example, that there is adult literacy, especially for women and youth who've not had access to formal education. We need to ensure that we are maintaining access to markets for the informal traders, because what usually happens is as things get formal, the informal people tend to get crowded out. You know, when countries are starting to ask for certificates of origin, informal traders are not going to know how to actually get get these certificates and be able to start marketing their goods. So these are some of the things that, even as human rights defenders, we are not only litigating, but some of the things people who are engaged in legal aid, for example, could be involved in giving these skills. How do you register your business? How do you get to access a certificate that you're supposed to show to a country where you're supposed to take your goods? But also there's issues to do with food security. Again, George talked about some of that, but also relating to freedom of movement of persons and child labor. Again, it is something that people who are working, especially around children, need to look at, because trafficking may likely happen a lot as people move across borders, and it has to be tracked and monitored. Then the other group that people haven't talked about much are the migrant workers and the refugees, because they also need to continue working as they go to their countries of destination, countries giving them asylum. They should be persons of interest, because in many cases, states are not giving them protection. Then the other socioeconomic issue that will arise is the cost and quality of goods and services. Again, George talked about the liberalization of things that is going to happen under the regional economy. And you know, when things are private sector led, the market determines how much things are costing. The forces of demand and supply apply, and we are likely to see less government stewardship as we engage with the various sectors. So what will be the cost of transportation? We need to interest our governments to have public transportation. You know, when there's industrialization, you saw the priority sectors. Transport is one of them. And for many countries, they are looking towards public-private partnerships as the mode for financing for a lot of the infrastructure that is happening. But as they do the PPPs, again, the person who's done the road is going to want to recoup the money that they put in. They will put road tolls that are going to be difficult. For example, for informal traders, you know, as you're going, if you need to use this road, you have to pay some money, and yet you need to get to country X. So these are bound to be problems for us. But also in the morning, Brian had talked about issues to do with education, healthcare. These are things that could become expensive in the process of going regional in terms of our engagement. Tax justice, again, we had talked about it briefly in the morning, and we know that the bigger players are the ones likely to push forward the agenda of the CFTA. And in doing so, we know that many of our countries end up giving tax waivers. You end up with a situation where the people who are earning more are actually not paying their fair share of taxes. And it becomes problematic also in terms of domestic resource mobilization, but also people who are earning less end up paying more taxes, and this is bound to be an issue. Corruption and illicit financial flows, again, they thrive in a regional economy like that because there is less regulation, and there are countries also in Africa that are havens for illicit financial flows. Countries like Mauritius, countries like Kenya, unfortunately, also are increasingly becoming tax havens, and we need to have these conversations happening if we are going to have the resources needed. The other risk is around increase in private debt, as people are being encouraged to take up the opportunity, because this is the speak that we have at the moment. You seize the opportunity, there is this opening up of trade, and everyone must have a cake. And there are loan sharks, you know, credit institutions. We talked about financial services, and these people are going to be pushing loans down the throats of especially vulnerable groups. You see, even with these telecom companies, the Safaricom's and all, they've even started pushing loans to people. Just even on your phone, they say, you can borrow, we can give you up to this much, and you'll be able to do business. So we need to look out for the vulnerable groups, because they are going to get convinced to actually take up these loans and end up in debt, and in the long run they are going to lose, because many conversations from people are around the public debt that governments are taking up. But what is happening? People are even now committing suicide because of debts. You know, especially the vulnerable groups, people who are, for example, SACCOs in their communities. You know that these people go and borrow in a group, and once the microfinance or whoever has lent them is asking for their money, they will go and harass everybody in the group. You know, they will even call your relatives who are in your phone book, and they're asking for their money. So people are getting increasingly frustrated, and yet their governments are encouraging them. You borrow in order to engage in business. So there has to be accessible credit lines for especially vulnerable groups that governments have to be putting in place, having funds that women, youth, you know, can be able to access, instead of being at the mercy of these loan sharks who are pushing money down their throat. And then another issue that has been discussed is around the increased digitalization of economies and what is likely to happen. You know, there are the obvious things about profiling of people and ending up in discrimination, but also as countries are digitalizing, the exclusion that results from that, because some people have not been able to access the systems that are there for registration. It is something that we need to look into, and of course issues around food security, not only with regard to the economic activities, the environment being able to, the environment changing, but also as people are engaging in trade, you know, they will tend to ignore, you know, for example, in Uganda, we have a situation where people have been encouraged to grow cash crops like sugarcane, and they are not growing food anymore. And this impacts on especially vulnerable groups as countries are pushing for cash crops. So we need to look out for that. So what are some of the challenges we are likely to face as we go about the protection of human rights within the regional economy? economy. One of them is the transnational character of the businesses, the fact that people are going to be moving across borders, you're applying different legal regimes. So if there is no standardization, if there is no harmonization of policies, this is going to be a challenge for us, but also the multiple players involved. Earlier you heard that, for example, RECs are being recognized as being at the forefront, but then, you know, there is a lot of them, and you have to deal with different states involved, but also we have weak legal and policy frameworks. And then again, I talked about the liberalization and the fact that we are going to be mostly private sector led, and this will likely lead to corporate capture of states. And you know that where corporations take over, many times they're interested in a deregulated environment, and which may be difficult in terms of holding corporate entities to account. Then, of course, protection of human rights defenders. And this is something that, as human rights defenders, we have to be very aware of, that once you're engaging in a situation where there is corporate actors, you have to be very clear about the facts you have, because you're going to see many defenders, if they are not going to be harassed, then people will be sued by corporate entities, because they put aside a lot of money to be able to do this. So we need to be careful and make sure that we are speaking facts and we have evidence before we engage in these conversations. So in terms of some of the instruments that could be useful, I will not repeat the African human rights instruments, but maybe what I could talk about that could be useful, especially for social protection, is the recently adopted protocol on social security and social protection for citizens. It has a lot of useful provisions, for example, around portability of benefits that we've been talking about, what exactly countries should be covering from our own perspective as Africans. But this is an instrument that was adopted in February, but then it's not yet got the necessary ratifications. So that could be one of the key areas that we are looking into, ensuring that countries are adopting, they are ratifying this protocol, because it will be useful going forward. Then also with the national regulatory frameworks, we need to strengthen them, because they do provide for important, again, like we didn't get into the detail of business and human rights, but there are some important concepts there, for example, regarding free, prior and informed consent from communities, regarding mandatory human rights due diligence, regarding duty of care, that we need to be looking at in terms of strengthening our national laws. And the important one, like I said in the beginning, is the extraterritorial obligations of states. And here is looking at the responsibility, the obligation of the state to ensure that the companies that are within their jurisdiction are not engaging in human rights abuses beyond their jurisdiction. There's a lot of conversation we could have there if people are interested, but also leveraging agendas 2063 and 2030. There's a lot there for us to use, but also the UN Global Compact, the guiding principles on business and human rights. And here, just to also talk about the role human rights defenders could play in encouraging national governments to develop national action plans on business and human rights. For now, it's only Uganda and Kenya that do have on the African continent. Some countries are in the process, like Zambia, but it would be a useful thing to do for all countries in order to domesticate the guiding principles on business and human rights. And of course, there is OECD guidelines that are talking about responsible business conduct that we could also be able to utilize. Lastly, on the role of human rights defenders, we need to, first of all, know that under the business and human rights context, human rights defenders are recognized as key players. And for example, they are recognized as experts that could be able to provide useful resources, but also that are helpful in terms of engaging in mandatory human rights due diligence. So that is an opportunity that we could seize as human rights defenders. And of course, what we talked about, the research, knowledge creation, evidence gathering is also important. But also, lastly, what I could talk about is facilitating access to remedy. As human rights defenders, we could not only through litigation, but sometimes what is important is engaging in mediation. And then there is also policy advocacy. For example, even with the different human rights mechanisms that do exist, we could be able to work with them to strengthen the legal and policy frameworks that do exist, and also support some of the ongoing initiatives, for example, around a binding treaty on business and human rights. On the last slide, Eddie, I would skip the next one and you go to the last slide. And I had wanted us to have a conversation on whether there can be consensus in this room around whether we need to have an AU binding instrument on business and human rights. Like we said earlier, there has been a process for developing a policy framework on business and human rights, but it has never been concluded. But in my view, we need to really think about a binding instrument. And partly it's because the efforts at the global level have been frustrated by some of the powerful countries that benefit from the status quo of us not having a binding instrument on business and human rights, again, because it's their companies that mostly benefit. So at the regional level, we need to have this conversation, and also in relation to the issues of tax justice and in relation to the issues of illicit financial flows, we need to discuss whether we need to push for a regional tax body that standardizes what needs to be done in terms of having businesses pay their fair share of taxes. And what is also most critical, this one is not for discussion, is around strengthening domestic legal frameworks around business and human rights. Lydia, if we still have time, probably you could go back and play the video that was just talking about the concept. And yes, and then I could end there. No, it's in there. It should be down in the, below that. If you click below, yeah, it doesn't come up. No. It's not, you're not seeing it on your screen. No?
Isn't online.
Yes. It's yeah.
As they look for the video, if you have burning questions from the presentation, it's going to be shared for reflection as well. As you noticed on the agenda, we'll have the panel discussion where some of these key issues are going to come out, and you have an opportunity to engage more on what, for example, Salima has discussed, the pillars that she mentioned, what key issues we have, what challenges we might face, but also what opportunities we might have. She has left us with discussions to ponder on whether we can have a regional tax body, a business and human rights policy that is binding on the continent to ensure that all the FCFTA works for everybody for the good of economic growth. And I think what she's really leaving us with is how to ensure that despite the gains that FCFTA is having on the continent, the implications for human rights do not negate the gains that we want to have, especially on the ECOSOC lens. So as we get the video, I think those are some of the key issues we need to ponder for tomorrow. But even now, as we think of questions, I will take only 4 questions, and I encourage the women in the room to take the first position to ask questions. Yes. So video is playing.
Businesses impact human rights wherever and however they operate. These impacts can be positive or they can be negative. These days, companies are global, and that means their impacts are too. Companies operate in poor countries and post-conflict countries, in countries where the local government is unable or unwilling to enforce its own laws. With all this complexity, it's not always clear who's responsible for preventing companies from violating human rights. Is it the company's fault for paying less than a living wage? Or is it the government's fault for setting the minimum wage below the poverty line? Victims of corporate human rights abuses find themselves trapped between two actors who have no interest in making things right. In 2011, the United Nations issued a set of principles that define the responsibilities of governments and businesses for solving this dilemma. So what do these principles say? There's 3 pillars. The first says that governments have to make sure that businesses don't violate anyone's human rights. That means passing laws that prevent human rights violations, but also making sure these laws are implemented. Some of the world's largest multinational corporations are owned and operated by states. The guiding principles say that governments have to prevent human rights violations by businesses, even if the state itself is acting like one. The second pillar says that businesses have to refrain from violating human rights wherever and however they do business. That means it's not enough for companies to simply follow the law where they operate, or to audit a few of their suppliers. Even in countries where the government doesn't take up its own duty, companies have to know their human rights impacts and take concrete steps to improve them. The guiding principles don't offer any loopholes. Companies are responsible for all human rights. Doing things like building a school or digging a well doesn't get them out of their basic responsibility not to make their workers and communities worse off. Companies have to perform human rights due diligence. That means talking to the people whose lives they might be affecting. Like the government responsibility, respecting human rights isn't a switch that companies can turn on and off. It's a continuous process. The third pillar of the guiding principles is about what happens when something goes wrong. If a company abuses human rights, governments have to make sure that the court system or some other legitimate process allows the victims to file a complaint and that that complaint is investigated and settled. Companies have this obligation too. Part of human rights due diligence is allowing people affected by the company to file grievances and participating in processes to make them right. Whatever route they choose, remedy mechanisms should fit with the effectiveness criteria defined by the guiding principles. If the complaint system is slow, or it costs too much money, or it's far away, it doesn't count. So that's what the guiding principles on business and human rights say. So why are they important? First, the principles were unanimously approved by the UN Human Rights Council. Since then, they've been endorsed by governments and business actors all over the world. Before, we argued over who was responsible for preventing human rights abuses by companies. Thanks to the UN guiding principles, we know who's responsible. That means that instead of arguing over the rules, we can get to work implementing them.
Thank you for the video. And I would like now to open the floor to only 4 questions. The first opportunity will go to the ladies. If there is no questions from the ladies, then I will invite the gentlemen. Any questions from the ladies? No, it's not. Yes?
Bonsoir tout le monde. Cette fois-ci, je me permets de parler en français. Madame l'intervenante, a mentionné dans son intervention qu'il y a vraiment l'interdépendance entre les droits humains et les affaires. Et depuis ce matin, la plupart des intervenants ont mentionné des exemples en rapport. Et en rapport exactement de cette interdépendance, elle a mentionné les obligations extraterritoriales dans lesquelles les pays membres sont obligés de faire respecter les droits humains à l'égard des compagnies internes qui font exactement des affaires et pour diminuer l'implication des violations des droits humains. Parmi les réponses et les remèdes proposés, l'intervenante a proposé que les États membres doivent mettre en place des lois nationales qui doivent faire respecter les droits humains dans les affaires. Et ma question est celle-ci. La plupart des pays ratificateurs des différents accords, non seulement qui ne respectent pas vraiment à la lettre des accords ou des traités déjà ratifiés, mais malheureusement même les acteurs de la justice, voire même les des droits humains internes, ne sont pas libres, ni même compétents, si je me permets de dire ça, pour faire respecter les différents droits invoqués dans les accords et les traités déjà signés. Et pour le cas d'espèce, qu'est-ce que vous prévoyez? Quant aux compétences et quant à la protection des défenseurs des droits de l'homme. C'est ça ma question. Merci.
There was another question in the corner. Please ask your question. I think let's take all of them and then she can respond.
Good afternoon. I comment or a question on remedies when violated of business. I have concern when we see there's like mass migration of youth, especially young women, going to work in the Middle East. The rights violated, everyone knows, and there's public outcry, but almost nothing is done about it. And as a continent, I don't think we are doing anything at all because we see there are more recruitment agencies, they're legal, they're registered, they are sometimes legally. When you go to the airport, almost every time you see like there's a long queue of girls headed to Saudi Arabia or somewhere in the, and it's, for me, it's a very big concern. Like, what are we doing about it? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, another lady, or I'll open to the gentleman. Yes, we have 3 slots. If there's none, she can respond to that and we can close for the evening. Okay, Mr. Burma, you could ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Salima, for your great presentation. I mean, the business and human rights is it's been discussed for a long time now, and you mentioned that somehow it's stalled because some, I mean, big people, maybe the beneficiaries of corporate engagements, have not allowed it to continue to have a binding principle or binding treaty on business and human rights at global level. So I was wondering what makes you think that at African level it won't be stalled? You know, what do you think would happen such that at the African level there will be greater possibility? Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Or oh, yes. There's a lady.
It's affirmative action. Mine is not a question. It's a comment on the consensus building on the AU binding instrument on business and human rights. And maybe it comes also with a caution. The ongoing process in adopting the AU or the Continental policy on business and human rights is what has stalled for a couple of years now. And hopefully the hurdles will be resolved maybe this year or early next year to be adopted during the next assembly. The caution on the other side is the proliferation of instruments. And that has always been the argument, even at the AU level. I remember the draft policy initially had come as a mini protocol of some sort, but it had to be changed into a policy framework intentionally, because the argument was that we have binding instruments already that provide for those specific human rights. Even the details within the policy now, that you don't necessarily need something binding, but something that can accompany or elaborate the human rights policies, human rights standards that are already existing. Maybe a conversation for this forum, or what we might have to build consensus on, is then how do we take that policy and localize it? Because even if it's non-binding, how do member states intend to actually apply the provisions that are put in the policies beyond the national action plans that the UN guiding principles are providing for? The argument again has been policy against the guiding principles from the UN. So for me, the concerted efforts of all concerned in localizing or taking the provisions of the policy to the national levels is probably the game changer.
Thank you, Rizan. Salima, I'll now invite you to respond, and we'll close for the day.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure I understood correctly the French question, but I think it was about how do we build the skills of the various players, judiciary and other human rights defenders around being able to defend human rights?
Je sais pas. Okay, let's try in English. Sorry, I need to try in English. I don't know that I am able to transmit my message. I have a question about the national law, les lois nationales. Vous avez mentionné que il faut sorry, qu'il faut quand même que les pays membres, les pays ratificateurs de l'accord doivent mettre en place des lois nationales pour éviter l'implication des compagnies et des gens d'affaires aux violations des droits de l'homme, si ma mémoire est bonne.
Okay. I translate. Okay. Yes, she was saying that countries have ratified convention regarding the African Continental Free Trade Area, but they need laws, national laws, to be implemented for respect of human rights. That's in brief.
So what? Ma question réside dans le fait que ces lois nationales, pour être la solution, il faut que ces lois doivent être appliquées à l'interne. Mais le problème, même les acteurs, la plupart des acteurs judiciaires, non seulement que la plupart ne sont pas au courant de ces lois nationales, mais malheureusement, les autres ne sont pas ni indépendants, mais sont aussi incompétents, si je l'ose dire. Alors, la question est celle-ci. Comment espérer trouver la solution dans les lois nationales alors que les gens qui sont censés de les appliquer ne sont pas si indépendants, non plus non pas suffisamment au courant de ces lois et comment les appliquer, et comment aussi les défenseurs des droits humains peuvent intervenir alors que les gens qui devraient collaborer avec eux ne sont pas à mesure d'appliquer et de protéger les droits qui étaient censés être protégés. Je ne sais pas que ma question vraiment est si claire. Oh, Lord.
Let me just attempt a response. So you say that many countries have ratified the trade agreement, but nationally we have weak laws and institutions that do not have the capacity to implement whatever is in the agreement. So I guess as correct earlier in saying that you were talking about skills building, capacity building for these institutions. And I guess, you know, like there is nobody who's really going to take up this responsibility. I think this meeting is the first step. All of us have a role to play in terms of building the capacity of the various institutions, the judiciary, in order to enable them understand what their roles should be with regard to business and human rights, and also to sensitize around the Continental Agreement around free trade. So it is everybody's role, really. You cannot put it on one institution, and I think already with this meeting, we're in the right direction towards doing that, because it's assumed that everybody from here is going to do something nationally. There are other issues about the structure of these institutions, like the judiciary not being independent, but I guess that is a setup that is at national level. It's a challenge for many states, but it doesn't stop us from trying to build the capacities of the judiciary and pushing for accountability, much as there could be systemic challenges in terms of independence of the players. There was a comment about externalization of labor, the labor exports in the different countries. I agree, you know, many of our countries haven't been very strong in terms of regulating that space, and everywhere, whenever people are moving out of country, they are basically on their own for the most part. And this is part of the reason we are saying we need stronger regulation around business and human rights that is also extraterritorial, where states need to take care of their people even once they are out there trying to earn a living. But it's a big challenge. It's beyond the continent. It may not be a big problem between African states, but it's a problem that is external to Africa, and it says a lot about our politics and the priorities that we have as countries in terms of creating jobs. And one could argue that perhaps this continental free trade area could help us create more jobs on the continent to be able to reduce on the externalization of labor. But as it is now, we have to push our countries domestically to ensure that they have bilateral agreements with the countries that are receiving the people that we are sending, and improve their living situation and the pay that they have. Why do I think that at African level, the process of developing a framework or an instrument on business and human rights won't stall? And why I said, you know, we need to build consensus. I believe part of the problem, and this links also to what Rizan was saying earlier, I think part of the problem with the global system was the corporate lobby and the lobby of the powerful states that stand to benefit from the status quo, because for them they are using WTO rules, they are using investor-state dispute settlement arrangements, which favor them for the most part, and they have no interest in seeing an instrument that is coming up to protect the less developed countries, which is what the binding treaty on business and human rights seeks to do, to protect our natural resources, to protect our people. And I think at that global level, there is an issue. But as Africans, and as we are looking towards, creating a regional economy, we have to take African interests at heart. It is a challenge because of the different politicians that we have, but I think that is also the role as human rights defenders we have to convince our people that we need to protect ourselves also from external players. Earlier, George said, we don't even know the interests of GIZ and all those kinds of players. But part of their issue is they are protecting their own companies. They want to have their own interests first. And as Africans, we have to fight back. So for us to protect ourselves from the interests of big multinational players, we have to really work towards having this instrument, because again, like it was said, many of them will come and incorporate as national companies. So you will get almost, for many of our countries, the banks that we have are not local banks. They are not even African for the most part. But they will come and incorporate, and they're the ones that are going to benefit from the free trade because they've registered as local companies. So there has to be stronger regulation, and we have to push for stronger state stewardship, because a free market economy is simply not going to work. It is simply not going to protect vulnerable groups. If we leave it to companies, we are going to have a situation where the majority are left behind. And whether it is a policy or an instrument, I think in a situation, again, where we have either state inability to regulate or unwillingness to regulate corporate actors, human rights defenders and communities have to have an instrument that they can directly enforce with the courts of law, which is why I'm more inclined towards having a more binding instrument that is legally enforceable, that people can use by themselves to actually enforce these rights. It's not true that all that instrument would be doing is already provided for. For example, if I asked which of our documents push for mandatory human rights due diligence on the side of companies, or which of our laws specifically provide for free, prior, and informed consent, it really isn't there. So it's not true that it would be a duplication, but I understand the challenges. And I know, when at the commission, one time there was a conversation around business and human rights, specifically the policy framework, and the EU sent a big delegation to the commission, to convince them not to have this conversation. It's just that the stalling, and partly it's because of who is financing work within the African Union, because they have no interest in seeing us regulate things better. And until we find our own resources and do these processes, I don't think we shall benefit from this free trade arrangement.
Thank you so much, Salima. A very big round of applause for you. And I think tomorrow's panel discussion will have more questions, more engagement and discussions. So as she mentioned, you can see that as human rights defenders, we play a very pivotal role in ensuring that we bring our states to accountability, but also that there's a very good balance between human rights and business for quality economic growth. So tomorrow, reflect on the discussions that we've had today, and all the presenters will be present, minus the toolkit and study report, but the rest who are present here will be with us for a thorough discussion and engagement on some of the challenges they envision, what are the good recommendations. George was having to rush through his presentation on some of the recommendations and studies that could be used for comparative purposes. So thank you so much, Salima. Thank you, presenters today. We are grateful for your time and your input. And tomorrow, please, let's keep time. Let's be here at 8. It is not going to be at 9. We are starting at 8. If you come at 9, you'll be 1 hour late. All right. Thank you for today, and thank you for your patience. Thank you.